This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Cyclone landings are becoming more frequent in the southern African region, or so it seems. Cyclone Idai struck with devastating force in 2019. However, Cyclone Freddy just outdid Idai, becoming the longest-lived natural disaster ever recorded. But it isn't just cyclones. Floods are wreaking havoc in the Great Lakes region. Raging water and mudslides have left behind destruction in DR Congo and Rwanda. Now the big question is, are these disasters becoming more frequent? And how is Africa prepared to deal with these events? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. While the cost of lives lost and property destroyed in natural disasters can be considerable. In Malawi, families are slowly rebuilding after Cyclone Freddy. My colleague Daniel Arap Moy brings us more from Blantyre.
The road to recovery after Cyclone Freddy may seem long and difficult, but people in Malawi have risen up to the challenge, rebuilding their homes damaged by the record-breaking Cyclone Freddy. Olive Lodon, a 23-year-old resident of Chilobwe, lost her home and business to Freddy.
My parents had 5 rental units that supported the family. Unfortunately, all the units were destroyed during the cyclone. The best we can do is pick up our losses and rebuild our homes.
Many people who were affected by the disaster here are not waiting for external support to rebuild their homes. They are trying to rebuild on their own, but many are not able to meet other basic needs.
The challenge that we are facing here is shortage of food, shortage of relish, and shortage of water.
The city authorities say they are working tirelessly to mobilize resources to help those badly affected.
What currently we are doing, it's mostly to coordinate the efforts that the government is doing and even the efforts that the council is doing by mobilizing resources locally as well as those who are living outside the city and they are willing to help those people who have been affected by the cyclone.
According to the authorities, deforestation caused by people making charcoal only added to the disaster. The soil in these hilly areas of the city was loosened, creating the right conditions for mudslides. The government has advised those still living in flood-prone areas to relocate before another disaster strikes. Daniel Arap Moy, CGTN, Blantyre, Malawi.
Well, joining me now to take a closer look at the impact of natural disasters in Africa are from Nairobi, Ambassador Giovanna Valverde Stark, Costa Rica's ambassador to Kenya and permanent representative to the United Nations Environment Programme and UN Habitat. From Blantyre in Malawi, Lucy Mtelatila, Director of the Department of Climate Change and Meteorological Services. And from Maputo in Mozambique, Professor Denis Juizo, full professor of hydrology and water resources management at Eduardo Mondlane University. Welcome everyone to the program. Lucy, if I may start off with you. For 3 years in a row now, Malawi has experienced climate-induced disasters. Cyclone Idai, Tropical Storm Anna, and now Cyclone Freddy, which also affected Mozambique and Madagascar. What is the current scale of destruction and what has been the impact on the local population, on the economy and on the environment?
Yes, I agree with you that the past 4 to 5 years has been very terrible for Malawi in terms of the climate extremes, in terms of tropical cyclones. Actually, there are not only 3, there are 5, because in 2019 we have Tropical Cyclone Idai and Kenneth, and in 2022 we had Tropical Cyclone Anna and Gombe, and this year Tropical Cyclone Freddy, which has proved to be the worst of all. Actually, usually when we are looking at the tropical cyclone, the impact has been on floods, But this year, we've also noted that we are very vulnerable also to landslides. So the figures that we are seeing of the people who died and people who were displaced, mainly were also due to the landslides that took place over in many districts over the southern parts of the country. So this is an indicator that as we are trying to recover from the tropical cyclone Anna and Gombe from last year, then this other tropical cyclone has also impacted us, and definitely it's affecting our economy, because it's really challenging, because we are in that terrible state where we need to strategize again on how we recover from tropical cyclone Freddy.
Professor Juzo, these cyclones and this flooding have been back-to-back for Mozambique as well. You're watching this from Maputo, directly affected. What have been the main characteristics of each of these cyclones in terms of their size, their strength, and their impact? How do you see them evolving and the trends you're observing in terms of frequency and severity?
I would say this is a quite challenging topic to address. There are many aspects that one should look at when trying to compare, even between the different events. Let's say, starting, for instance, with Eileen 2000, that was the major history or story that was going around about the devastation that caused in Mozambique, and many others that followed. And now recently, with these major storms or systems like the Kenneth and Ida in 2019, when just within a short period of time from one and another. But when you look at those things, you will find a lot of problems that are linked to the issue of governance, land planning, but also the accelerated ratio of increase in population in our regions. So the type of land use that is been changing and the way we use our river basins and so on, and also the way population of our people, communities are able to create their own buffer, let's say, capacity to deal with some of these events. Because just before the Eden and Kenneth cyclone, Mozambique and the whole region of Southern Africa was living through a drought that spanned for 6 years almost. And now we're dealing with floods caused by these 5 systems that we've talked about, but we don't know if immediately after that we'll be entering into a drought period that also has a silent but also significant devastating impact in our communities.
Lucy, let me just come back to you briefly, because you talked about Cyclone Freddy impacting an economy that was still trying to recover. How much of a setback has this been on Malawi?
We can really we cannot quantify the loss of life that has been there, because if you look at tropical cyclone Freddy, where over 600 people lost their lives and over 500 people missing, we cannot quantify that. Of course, when it comes to infrastructure, yes, the assessment is still underway to understand how much the damage and the losses are there and how much we may need for us to recover. But for sure, these are billions of money, which, of course, looking at the GDP of the country, that means we've lost a lot that would have supported us in our development. So this is indeed a setback, because we for sure, we really need a lot for us to recover. And I'm still waiting for the report. When it's ready, probably then we'll understand the extent of this tropical cyclone.
Ambassador Valverde Stark, over to you now, because it is not just cyclones that have impacted Africa. You know, the DRC and Rwanda are currently also in the midst of severe flooding. Are these natural disasters becoming worse or more frequent over time?
Well, I will speak from my experience in Costa Rica, which is a tropical country, and also it's within the Central American Isthmus, which is one of the most highly vulnerable areas of the planet in terms of climate change, because we have the Atlantic on one side, the Pacific on the other. So we get hit pretty often by hurricanes. So what I can tell you is, historically, we have seen an increase in the number of hurricanes and cyclones, and therefore flooding as well. So it's the same scenario as you have here in Africa.
Lucy, I want to talk about preparedness here because meteorological departments forecast extreme weather patterns every so often. So what happens to the information when you forecast disasters?
Yes, so as meteorological services, we do forecast. And for us to do the forecast, there are so many issues that we need to put together. One of them is the observations, which are very important. But in our region already, we have some challenges when it comes to weather observations. And, you know, we need specialized information like weather radar, which are really scarce. And because these ones, they can even detect severe weather events like tropical cyclones. But of course, with the limited capacity that we have, we still do issue warnings. And these warnings are sent to various stakeholders. And of course, as we are producing the warnings, there are different models that we rely upon. They have different challenges, but still at the end of the day, we still have to provide these warnings. But now the gap also comes in sometimes while we disseminate these warnings, because right now we rely on, we call them extension services, which we rely upon for them to disseminate the information to the communities. So you can see already that the channel is so long. We have to pass on this information through different channels for it to get to the communities. We also rely on community radios. And of course, we also try to use some social media, but you know, this social media like WhatsApp and Facebook are limited to people who are probably in urban areas, but not in the rural setting.
Let me come back to you, Professor Giuso. Are people and governments not acting on these forecasts? Because Mozambique as well, you know, has had these devastating calamities over the last few years.
Within the southwestern Indian basin, there is a lot of information that is generated through regional, but also other, like the UK Met Office or the French Met Office. They all generate information that tells you about the occurrence of any disturbances in the system that are likely to lead to occurrence of a hurricane or a system that is likely to affect the region. But in case of the continental Africa, let's say Southern Africa, in our case, Mozambique and Malawi, it's only when you are within a few days of the event that you know the final path that the cyclone is going to take. So prior to that, you have a number of models that are used to try to predict the route that the cyclone is likely to take, but that becomes a very wide area. And you cannot mobilize all this population at once to be ready for something that you're not sure that is going to happen. So that becomes a challenge. Then your window of action becomes limited. And therefore, that's why you have to have communities and institutions that are well prepared to act quickly. As soon they know with more precision what will be the final landing path of this system. So this is there's no 100%, let's say, accuracy in the forecast until you are very much closer to the event itself. So it's not because they don't want to do it; it's because our capacity at the moment in terms of knowledge and tools, it only allows for so much.
So let's talk a little bit about solutions here, Ambassador Valverde Stark, because the United Nations has a plan of action on disaster risk reduction for resilience. What are some of the key aspects of this, and are they being implemented in Africa?
Well, yes, I mean, that's why you have the different conventions, and they do have, or they support the countries in terms of elaborating their national plans. For risk management, for early warning systems. But I believe that exactly as the professor just mentioned, you may have those things, but if you don't have the supporting institutions to actually help the different local communities or local governments to prepare, you know, it won't be very effective. So I think that that's part of the key to this whole situation, is not only having these early warning systems or risk management strategies, is to be able to have the work connecting the government and the local communities or local governments. Also very important, I want to share when in our experience back in 2010, because I was part of the team, that we actually decided that we didn't have a vulnerability map of the country. And that's very important because then you know which one are the areas of the country that are constantly getting hit by the droughts, the floods, the slow coming, what they call slow incoming, increasing sea level. So we started doing that, 13 years ago. So we have a clearer map. Where are those areas that are the most vulnerable and hence need the most support from the government?
So we're going to be looking at the solutions to this crisis in just a moment. But for now, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we'll carry on our discussion on disasters and how prepared Africa is to deal with their impact. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me on the program, Ambassador Giovanna Valverde Stark, Lucy Mtilatila, and Dennis Juizo. Before the break, we looked at the impact of the recent spate of natural disasters on Africa. Let's now examine how countries in Africa can better be prepared. Ambassador Valverde Stark, it does seem that some countries tend to take a more reactive approach when natural disasters hit, despite early warning systems. What are some of the underlying factors that contribute to this reactive approach?
Well, I believe that that would be because of a lack of having preventive types of local and national strategies for the different communities to be able to react when confronted with climatic events. So if you're able to have preventive measures, you can have vulnerability mapping of your countries or regions. You can have your national adaptation plans. You can have resilience plans. People and the communities can be prepared for when they are hit, from hurricanes, cyclones, droughts, all of the events that are increasing due to global warming and climate change.
So given the frequency of floods and cyclones, though, I mean, are there efforts that you're seeing that are being made to support a more proactive approach?
Yes, for example, what for us has been extremely important is what we call nature-based solutions, and that means to protect and restore the ecosystems. For example, in the marine environment, you have the increasing of sea level that affects not only the water of the communities that live close to the coast, but also the crops and agriculture. So when you have countries where the tendency is to do things such as cut down mangroves, you are seriously making that community a lot more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, be it cyclones, hurricanes, and the slow onset of high increase of sea level. We were 80% we had deforestation rate in the 80s, and this had a serious impact on erosion, mudslides, as was mentioned before. And basically, we dedicated 30 years of our lives and said, we're going to revert this trend. And now we have 52% of our country has forest coverage. That has allowed us to do three things: mitigate greenhouse gases, adapt to climate change, and have more resilience in the communities that have greenery around them.
So, Professor Juizo, I want to look back to 2019 and to Tropical Cyclone Idai, one of the worst tropical cyclones on record to affect Africa and the Southern Hemisphere. Looking back today, were there measures at that time that proved effective in mitigating the impact of future cyclones?
This region that was affected by, especially in the central part of the country, in the Buzi Basin, there's been part of what we call pilot initiatives to improve preparedness of communities to floods, at least. So dealing with the direct effects, for instance, of strong wind gusts or very strong winds, that was not so much part of the initiative at the time. But Mozambique has done a lot after the floods and the disaster of 2000 in terms of producing a lot of information and plans, and so mapping the vulnerability of the country for various types of risks. So that knowledge is there. The communities in some cases have been trained, like I mentioned in the case of Buzi. So for that part of the basin, there was some level of preparedness to deal with the flood. But the scale of the flood was far above what anyone could have imagined. So it could not be prevented as such to the scale that the system was designed to. So, and this will always be the case in the future. We can only prevent to a certain extent. It's not possible to prevent against all possible events that the nature can throw to us. So, but still we should be aiming at not being hit at the same level as we were hit by previous events. That Mozambique has been making a good stride since the 2000s.
So I want to talk about a little bit about lessons learned here. How does the response to Cyclone Freddy differ from previous disasters? Are there important lessons that have been learned from these experiences in terms of helping in informing disaster preparedness and response efforts?
Yes, there was a very good response, especially in sectors like health, in sectors like shelter. They responded very well. Because, during the tropical cyclone Freddy, Malawi was also experiencing some cholera epidemic. And everyone was worried that probably with the tropical cyclone, it may also increase the spreading of cholera. But Ministry of Health took it on board, and they made sure that they control the spread of cholera. So the moment we issued the warning, they were also in the forefront to make sure that they supply all the relevant supporting issues so that people cannot contract these cholera issues. But what we've learned also from this tropical cyclone Freddy is the landslides. Yes, we've had landslides before, but this year the magnitude was very enormous. So we've learned a lot from that one, and that's the issue that is also, maybe as police say, they have to address on issues of settlements where people are constructing their settlements, because many people who were affected are those that are living in Hire and mountainous areas. So this is also a wake-up call for Malawians or for the policymakers to make sure that these landslides also should be taken on board when we are addressing all those policy issues, especially when it comes to settlements.
I want to get your final comments, Ambassador Valverde Stark. What do you see from your perspective as some of the key policy changes that African governments can implement to support more proactive approaches to natural disasters?
Well, I think the first one is to make vulnerability mapping of the countries. And of course, it's very difficult, especially if you have very, very large countries. My country is small, 52,000 square kilometers. So maybe you begin with the areas that you know are the most vulnerable, the ones that get hit all the time, either by flooding or by hurricanes, or, well, in this case, also droughts, which we're talking more about hurricanes, but it's exactly the same scenario. Those are areas that are affected by climate change. One way or another, it's just slower. If you have the mapping, also then you can quantify how they have been hit, and strengthening the actual infrastructure of housing or what have you. Then you can have a benchmark and say, okay, now we're going to build the houses better, the materials, the roofing, what have you. That's one thing. The other is the early warning systems are extremely important, and that means there has to be a very effective relationship between what are called like the meteorological national institutes or what have you, and that they have a good, close relationship with the respective ministries or the local governments. But I do want to say something else, and that is related to what the professor said, and it's, you can do all the planning in the world, but really the problem is the most vulnerable people, as he indicated, are the ones that live in the most difficult situations, and those are the ones in my country, I think in most developing countries, for example, they don't have the money to buy a house, so they're going to go camp next to a river, or they're going to go camp in the places that are the most vulnerable ones. It's not simple, but if you have contingency plans, it certainly can help reduce the impact.
Professor Juzo, your comments on the key policy changes that governments can implement to support a more proactive system.
I think it comes back to the Sendai framework, which is, I think, with its 4 pillars, it's fundamental. We need to have more knowledge, more technology, more research, more investment. So it's a lot to do with what already we have been saying. I mean, this does not come out of the blue, come from the experience, the shared experience of the global community, that we need to do this. The challenge in African countries is the lack of access, or the difficulty in accessing financing. If you want to put the infrastructure, be it for early warning, be it for escape roads, be it for safe havens and so on, and all that, whatever you want to consider, it all requires investment. Where will that investment come from? Where does the financing come from? The communities themselves cannot pull themselves out by themselves alone out of this vulnerability. Some central governments might be able to do something here and there, right. And maybe here the use of prioritization can be key. So you map your vulnerability and then you concentrate on the areas that are more vulnerable, the population that are most vulnerable, to try to reduce that. And if you invest on that, you get back a lot more than you invest. That's what we know. If you reduce this vulnerability and risk, the return on investment is quite high.
So let me get your concluding remarks here, Lucy. You've talked about the channels that you use to speak to the populations, but what role, though, can technology play in improving the effectiveness of disaster preparedness and response efforts? And what are some of the promising new technologies in this area that you're witnessing?
Yes, as I said earlier, that we need proper equipment that can help us to detect the cyclones, such as weather radar. But also, there is an important channel that we are not exploiting it much. That's the use of SMSs. We feel that probably at least the subscription of mobile phones in the rural areas is very high. And if we can also utilize this opportunity to make sure that the warnings, they go straight on people's handsets, probably that can also enhance how people can react and respond to such messages. Because when you get a message probably on your phone, you feel that this is your message and you have to act. So that's another area that we feel that it's very important that we explore, and probably we can also utilize that when it comes to dissemination of early warning messages to the public, especially the rural communities.
All right, a very interesting discussion there on disaster management, but that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all our guests: Ambassador Giovanna Valverde Stark, Costa Rica's ambassador to Kenya and permanent representative to the United Nations Environment Programme and UN Habitat; Lucy Mtilatila, Director of the Department of Climate Change and Meteorological Services; and Professor Denis Juizo, Full Professor of Hydrology and Water Resources Management at Eduardo Mondlane University. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep this conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, it's bye-bye.